As usual, the series is in memory of Elisheva Frist, Elisheva Sima Bat Zalman, Alea Shalom. Last week, we began the poem Yom Ze Mechubad Mikol Yamim. We're all keenly familiar with this song. Many of us sing it on Shabbat morning. I mentioned that it was composed by a person, Rabbi Yisrael HaGer, a convert from the 12th century. I mentioned as well that for years I thought it was Rabbi Yisrael Najara from Tzfat of the 16th century, but doing some research, I found out this song was predated Rabbi Yisrael Najara by 400 years. The themes, some of them lifted straight out of the Chumash, from the Aseret HaDibrot. On the page of the Mekorot, we have the first section of the Aseret HaDibrot, Shesh Yamim Zachot Yom HaShabbat HaKadosh, Shesh Yamim Tavod V'asita Gamotecha, and the next line, Lo Taseh Kol Melacha. And this is the first stanza of the Yom Ze Mechubad, Sheshit Yamim Taseh Melachtecha, Yom HaShvi Shabbat Le'Elokecha, Shabbat Lo Taseh Kol Melacha. It's just paraphrasing the first version of Shabbat in the Aseret HaDibrot. And then the second stanza basically talks about the second version, without mentioning the second version of the Aseret HaDibrot, but drawing our attention to Vayikra Perek Gimel in Parshat Emor that we nicknamed Parshat HaMoadot, the section that talks about all of the Chagim according to the calendar scheme: Pesach, Svirat HaOmer, Shavuot, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, and it ends with Vaydaber Moshe et Modeh Hashem Bnei Yisrael. And I'll just mention that those of you who know, after chapter 23 usually comes chapter 24. Usually. So what is chapter 24? Chapter 24 has nothing to do with the Chagim, apparently. It says, Vaydaber Shem Moshe lemor, Tzavet Bnei Yisrael, V'yikhu elecha shemen zayit zach katit lamaor, lahalot ner tamid. The mitzvah of lighting the menorah in the Beit HaMikdash. And what's strange about this pasuk is that it's copied from Sefer Shmot, Parshat Tetzaveh. V'ata tetzaveh et bnei Yisrael, v'yikhu elecha shemen zayit zach katit lamaor, lahalot ner tamid. It's a quote, it's not even a paraphrase. And why is it mentioned twice? So those who deal with remez, that means allusions in the Chumash, say that this is the next Chag after Sukkot. The next Chag, the next Yom Tov in the calendar is going to have something to do with the menorah and the oil in the Beit HaMikdash, and that's obviously Hanukkah. So there's a connection between the end of chapter 23, which is Sukkot, and the beginning of chapter 24, which is the mitzvah of lighting the menorah in the Beit HaMikdash, the Mishkan, the Beit HaMikdash. And the reason that it begs for explanation is because we know about this already from Chumash Shmot. V'ata tetzaveh b'nei Yisrael, v'yikhu elecha shemen zayit zach katit lamaor, lahalot ner tamid. Its repetition in Vayikra, Perek Kav Daled, signifies that it comes to teach us something extra. Okay, so this is just a thought, that the calendar continues even after Vayikra Perek Kav Gimel. But the section doesn't begin with Pesach. It begins with Shabbat, which is very strange. So all the Parshanim draw our attention, and I mentioned the very last week that the parsha that says Eile Mikra'ei Kodesh, Eile Moadei Hashem, these are the Chagim, Mikra'ei Kodesh, that are assigned Kedusha. We call them, we assign them Kedusha. The first one on the list is Shabbat. And that's there. And that's what the Paitan says, Rishon hu lemikra'ei Kodesh. Yom Shabbaton, Yom Shabbat Kodesh. Here's where Shabbat is referred to as Mikra'ei Kodesh. It's in Vayikra Kav Gimel, which puts Shabbat into the scheme of all of the Chagim that have something to do with Yitziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt. And on Kiddush, Friday night, this is indeed what we say. We mention creation, Zikaron L'Maseh Bereshit, Ki hu Yom Tchila L'Mikra'ei Kodesh. First on the list of Mikra'ei Kodesh, Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim. And I also mentioned last week that there is a version in the Yerushalmi Masechet Psachim, the very end, the 10th chapter, of the ending bracha for Kiddush, Baruch Atah Hashem, Mikadesh Yisrael V'Yom HaShabbat. Now, we don't say this. We say Baruch Atah Hashem, Mikadesh HaShabbat, because Shabbat has that added feature that HaKadosh Baruch Hu unilaterally assigned the day of Shabbat as a Yom Kadosh. Vayvarach Elokim et Yom HaShvi'i vaykadesh oto. Nevertheless, there's a second side to Shabbat that demands human activity. The pronouncement of Shabbat in its second phase requires something that we do. What do? We make Kiddush Friday night. And the making of Kiddush Friday night is the fulfillment of the mitzvah of Zachor Yom HaShabbat HaKadosh. This is what we do. And in the second version of the Seret HaDibrot, where the theme of Yetziat Mitzrayim is mentioned and not a word about creation, so I drew your attention last week to the Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim, which was source number 4, that the fact that in Egypt we worked for so many years without a day off. So giving us a day off right after we exited the Yam Suf, which was really the moment that we were really free. So a few days later, the mun falls because they all of a sudden didn't have food, and the mun will not fall on Shabbat, which means going to work meant opening the door and scooping up the mun from your doormat. But on Shabbat, you're not going to go to work. V'yom HaShvi, where it says, Al yetzei ish mimkomo b'yom HaShvi. Don't leave your house to bring up the mun on the seventh day, which means we got a tasting of Shabbat very early in the game in Parshat Bishalach, and this is about a month plus before Matan Torah. They don't know yet that there's 39 melachot. They don't know there's a Korban Musaf. They don't know all that, but they know that the seventh day is special. They know that, and I'll even throw in at this point a brilliant thought of Rav Ovadia Yosef, and I'll give you the background why he even said it. He said, we know that there are certain halachot that say that a person who's a desecrator of Shabbat, Mechalel Shabbat, so especially if he's a Mechalel Shabbat bifarhesia, which means public desecrator of Shabbat, so we won't drink his wine. He's almost treated like an idol worshiper. It's a sharp halakha. And we know that this is only if a person desecrates Shabbat deliberately. He knows exactly what Shabbat is. He knows the severity of Shabbat and so on. I'm not talking about somebody who's just not religious and is not familiar with Shabbat. That's called shogeg. It's certain inadvertent type. But a person mechalel Shabbat b'mezid, so it's a very, very serious crime in the Torah. So the idea of Shabbat, Yom HaShvi, the idea of the idea that somebody is a Mechalel Shabbat b'farhesia, Rav Ovadia said that is only if somebody is violating Shmirat Shabbat. Shmirat Shabbat means the melachot, the work. But a person can be somebody who violates the melachot, but nevertheless, the day of Shabbat is important to him. It's important. It's not like just another Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday. He's a Zachor at Yom HaShabbat. He remembers that the day of Shabbat is different and treats it differently. And what brought the Rav Ovadia to say this is that many of his Sephardi constituents in this country may not be full Shomrei Shabbat, but they are very much Zochrei Shabbat. I mean, we lived in Beersheba 7 years, and this is absolutely true. The Shabbat is Shabbat. I mean, people go to shul Friday night. The wife will light candles, the man will make Kiddush, and then they'll watch TV afterwards. Or in the morning, they'll go to shul, and they'll go to the soccer game in the afternoon, the football game. I mean, this is okay to them, and so on. This is there, but Shabbat is different. It's very much not a weekday. That's Pikuach Nefesh. You got it. Good. That depends if they win or not. So the idea, and Rav Ovadia did not want to box out so many people in the country, categorizing them as Mechalel Shabbat. He didn't want to do that. And this is important. This is very important because sometimes there are cases of what's called integrity in a court situation, witnesses and so on. And if somebody may not be a full Shomer Shabbat, but is a Zocher Shabbat, so the Dayanim might rule leniently and accept his word anyway, because we're not going to disqualify what he's saying because he's not careful about every malacha. So that's an issue in itself. It's a full-blown shiur and a half to explain that concept. But the idea of being a Zocher Shabbat and a Shomer Shabbat are two different sections of the Aseret HaDibrot, the first in Sefer Shmot Parshat Yitro, the second in Devarim Parshat Ve'etchanan. So this is important, and the Rambam says this is really what the Parshat Emor Kav Gimel is all about. It's about the second Aseret HaDibrot, and there it doesn't say Al Kain Beirach Hashem et Yom HaShabbat Vaykacheyu as it says in the first one. It says Al Kain Tzivcha Hashem Elokecha La'asot et Yom HaShabbat. You have to do something. The word La'asot is proactive, means you have to do something. And the doing something means you're sanctifying, which means that if a person doesn't make Kiddush, he's a non-Shabbos observer, okay? Let's not call him a Mechalel Shabbat, a non-Shabbos observer. It's still Shabbos. You can't say because he didn't make Kiddush, it's not Shabbos. But he did not apply the second level of Kedushat Shabbat. That must be done by Am Yisrael. And if you don't do it, you don't have it. You just have the first level of Kadosh Baruch Hu, sanctity of Shabbat. But Am Yisrael's level of sanctity of Shabbat is created by Am Yisrael as through Kiddush. And that's the La'asot at Yom HaShabbat. So we have the Yom Ze Mechubad in the second stanza, focusing on the second side of Shabbat as well. Rishonu L'Mekrei Kodesh, Yom Shabbaton, Yom Shabbat Kodesh. And because the Kiddush, yes, this is the last point that we made last week, the Kiddush actually leads to the fulfillment of Shabbat as we understand it. So therefore, the next line is Al Kain Kol Ish B'Yeino Yekadesh, and everybody's going to make Kiddush over a cup of wine. I mentioned parenthetically the dispute between the Rambam and other Rishonim. Does the cup of wine included in the biblical commandment? That you have to say something about Shabbat, articulate something about Shabbat, that everybody agrees. That the word Zachar doesn't mean walk around and have in your mind, that today is Shabbat. That's not good enough. It's not that kind of zechira. It's a zechira that mandates speaking, saying something, no different than Parshat Zachor. Zachor lo tishkach. So lo tishkach means don't forget it. So what is Zachor? It means you have to articulate it. So there's a concept of reading the Parshat Zachor. So, and same thing, the Rambam says, is the mitzvah of Sipu Yetziat Mitzrayim. The Rambam brings the source of relating the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim on Seder night, not from the classical pasuk that most people would cite, V'gadet levincha v'yom hahu lemor, that you shall relate the story. The Rambam brings the pasuk from Shmot Yud Gimel, Zachor et hayom hazeh asher yetzatem mi'eretz Mitzrayim. Remember the day that you left Egypt. The Rambam says this is the same Zachor as Zachor Yom HaShabbat. Means you have to articulate it. You have to say something. So on Friday night, you have to say something about Shabbat. And the Chachamim said, say it over a cup of wine. That's how Rambam understands Kiddush. There are others, the Ran Rabbeinu Nisim from Gerona and others believe that the cup of wine was included in the biblical command. Even though it doesn't say a word about cup of wine in the Aseret HaDibrot, it's a oral law add-on, but it's biblical nevertheless. So you have this machloket, this dispute on whether the cup of wine is biblical or rabbinic. But Kiddush is biblical, that's no question. And men and women are equally obligated to recite Kiddush Friday night, and that's why a man can say it and be moitzi a woman can say Kiddush and be moitzi a man, as long as everybody has kavanah, they want to fulfill the mitzvah, and they answer Amen, they listen to every word, so that works. But then he throws in, not only Al Kain Kol Ish B'Yeino Yekadesh, but also Al Shtei Lechem Tmimim, Yivtzeu Tmimim. So the word Tmimim, it either refers to the challah, they have to be whole, or it's just referring to Am Yisrael. Am Yisrael are tamim. So I brought the pasuk from Parshat Shoftim in source 5. Tamim tiyeh Hashem Elokecha. We have to be tmimim. We have to be tmimim, which means we have to be wholesome, without blemish as much as humanly possible. So it could be that the tmimim basically relates to Am Yisrael. And the reason that kind of explanation makes sense is because in the third stanza, he's going to refer to Am Yisrael as Deveikim, those who are connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that's lifted out of source 6, V'atem hadveikim b'Hashem Elokeichem chayim kulchem hayom. You are to be connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So there's a concept of Dveikut that wasn't developed by Baal Shem Tov and the Hasidic movement. The Baal Shem Tov and the Hasidic movement gave an interesting spiritual attachment to this concept of dveikut that has to do with an emotional response, and that's why dancing and singing became an integral part of Hasidic life. And there was even a record cut many years ago called Dveikus. And on the record Dveikus, it wasn't the Shabbos Hagadol drasha. It was songs. It was songs for uplifting and so on. So the idea of Shtei Lechem Yiftzut Mimim is also an integral part of Kiddush, as we mentioned already last week, and we cover the Chalus, so not to embarrass the Chalus, which we should be making a Hamoitzi Lechem and Aretz first, but we don't. We're making Kiddush first, which, as the Rav once explained, allows us, it opens up the possibility of a Sudat Shabbat. And then comes the third stanza, where we turn to the next two items on the Shabbat agenda, and they are Kavod and Oneg. In the Chumash, we only have Zachor and Shamar from the first two sets of the Aseret HaDibrot. But in Yeshayahu, where it says, V'karata Shabbat Oneg, V'likidosh Hashem Mechubad, there's some people who read these psukim in Kiddush in the morning. Right? If you look at a bencher, you have, the Rambam only knows that Kiddush in the morning is Bor Pergafen. That's it, Bor Pergafen. The Yemenites, that's their Kiddush, Bor Pergafen. So the Rav said this once in a towering shir for the yahrzeit of his father, Gimel Shvat, 1979, and in the presence of 3,000 people, and he talked about the concept of Kiddush in the morning as opposed to Kiddush in the evening, and he says this point that the Rambam believes that the Kiddush in the morning is only the Bor Pergafen, and he says that my grandfather, who was Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, the Rav from Brisk, that was his Kiddush Shabbos morning. So somebody had the gall in presence of 3,000 to yell out, what does the Rav do? I mean, it sounded like, my Zayda, he did this. But what do you do? He says, all right, I say the psukim, the beforehand. Why? So he gave two answers. The first one was just for the humor. He says, because it's printed in the benches. Now, anybody who knew the Rav knew that wasn't an answer. That was not an answer. That was just to get the 3,000 people on a roll. But then he says, don't you ever forget, I had another grandfather. And that was very instructive. Everybody has another grandfather. Whether you knew him or not doesn't make a difference. What he was trying to say was, everybody is a hybrid. So you have two different traditions. Now, true enough that under the chuppah, if somebody asks, so what minhag are we going to have in our household? Every Rav is going to say, you keep your father's minhag and his father's minhag and his father's minhag. That's what the Rav is going to tell you to do. Except what happens in reality, and sometimes it's a product of circumstance, you end up infiltrating some of the customs of your maternal grandfather. Why? You may have grown up in his house, and that's what you saw as a child. And that was your growing up and a Jewish experience. And it's exactly what happened to the Rav. His grandfather, Rabbi Elia Feinstein, who was Rabbi Moshe Feinstein's uncle, was the Rav in the town of Pruzhan, and the Rav grew up in his grandfather's house. The Rav's father and mother, in the first years of their marriage, lived by the in-laws. I mean, his mother lived by her parents, and the father lived by the in-laws until he became the Rav of Chaslovich. So he remembers Rabbi Feinstein's Kiddush. That's what he remembers Kiddush as a kid, as a child. So that became his Kiddush. And the fact that later in life he finds out that in Brisk his grandfather did it okay, it didn't impact. He just continues with the Kiddush that he grew up with. And he said, don't you ever forget, I had another grandfather. And that was extremely instructive for other areas of Jewish life. It's not just for Kiddush. Sometimes, you have a minhag and you know that your maternal grandfather did this. How come we're doing it in our house? It's okay. It's okay because we're hybrids. And we sometimes borrow from different sides of the family, especially in this country, where the majority of weddings are across ethnic lines. So you have people with, usually it's leniencies that kick in, usually. But not always. Sometimes, with a chumrah factory works overtime, you pick up other things. So what you have here is kavod and oneg. V'karata Shabbat oneg v'likdosh Hashem mechubad. So kavod Shabbat is defined by the Rambam in the 30th chapter of the Mishneh Torah, of Hilchot Shabbat, as everything you do before Shabbat in preparation of Shabbat. Now the Rambam lists things that you do on Friday. He talks about bathing, he talks about changing clothing, setting the table, cleaning the house, all preparing the food, and so on. So this is all we call Kvod Shabbat. It seems to be a Friday idea. The only thing is I have a source where Kvod Shabbat is mentioned in the context of Thursday. So just in case you do your pre-Shabbos preparations on Thursday, you're still getting a mitzvah of Kvod Shabbat. You don't have to wait. Yefeh, it was market day. Monday and Thursday was market day, but Monday was too early, right? But Thursday was okay, was market day. And the Mishnah talks about the fast days for drought in Eretz Yisrael that became upgraded to public fast days of a serious nature. And it said that there were certain of those fast days that people didn't even work. They just davened the whole day and fasted. It was Monday, Thursday, Monday, Thursday, Monday, Thursday, Monday. A series of 7 fast days for drought in Eretz Yisrael. But then it said that the market could open up in the afternoon on Thursday, mipnei kavod Shabbat. Because of Kvod Shabbat, people have to buy their things for Shabbos. So this mipnei kavod Shabbat is mentioned in the Mishnah in the context of a Thursday, which already says that you can have Thursday also. Now there are some people who start preparing their gefilte fish on Wednesday, and okay, some people are very OCD'd about Shabbos preparations, and so somebody once said there's even a remez, an illusion, that you can start preparing for Shabbos on Wednesday. Because this morning we said Hayom Yom Revi'i b'Shabbat, and how did it end? It ends with L'chuna Ranana. So when you say L'chuna Ranana in the Shir Shayim, what are you thinking about? Friday night. So but that's not a serious comment. That's just a. But okay, Yefeh Mod. So the Machloket Beit Shammai Beit Hillel is, according to Beit Shammai, if he would see something on a Sunday or Monday, a good item that obviously is not going to spoil, and he's going to keep it for Shabbat. He came across a choice wine on a Tuesday, he wouldn't drink it on Tuesday, he'd keep it for Shabbos. Correct. In other words, he already had in his mind from Sunday on, and we do in the Shir Shal Yom, Hayom Yom Rishon b'Shabbat, Hayom Yom Sheni b'Shabbat. The idea is that Shabbat is on our minds even at the beginning of the week. So according to Beit Shammai, he's preparing for Shabbat already early in the week. Beit Hillel said, Baruch Hashem Yom Yom. Today's Tuesday, I got a nice bottle of wine, Bar Priagofen, let's have a shot. Right? And it'll be on Friday. There are some who try to explain that machloket against the background of economics. We know that Beit Shammai people were more of the higher society, the upper level of society, and for them, a bottle of wine wasn't a big deal. What was a big deal was Shabbat, and therefore they were able to hold on with, because they had other wine. So okay, so this is a better choice wine, so we'll keep it for Shabbat, but it's not that they're not going to have wine to drink on a Tuesday. So they'll hold off with it, and the Beit Hillel, they were paupers, and therefore, you get a bottle of wine on Tuesday, you don't know what's going to be tomorrow. So Baruch Hashem Yom Yom, every day make a bracha. And some even go so far and suggest that this is what governs the machloket between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel in the nusach of Kiddush Friday night. What comes first? And that's not the joke of who's on first. What comes first? Do you say Bar Priagofen and then Mekadesh Shabbat as we do? Or should you say Mekadesh Shabbat bracha and only afterwards Bar Priagofen? So the first is Beit Hillel, and that's what we do. We hold like Beit Hillel. We say Bar Priagofen, and then we say the bracha of Mekadesh Shabbat. But Beit Shammai says that you say the Mekadesh Shabbat first and the Bar Priagofen afterwards. And the explanation was given was that to Beit Shammai, a bottle of wine was no big deal. Shabbat was a big deal. So you want to make the Mekadesh Shabbat first. Then, of course, you have to say Bar Priagofen in order to allow you to drink the wine. But Beit Hillel, it was a struggle to get a cup of wine for Kiddush by Friday night. So the first thing he wanted to do was make a bracha, Bar Priagofen. I'm not sure, that's not the pshat in the Gemara, by the way. The Gemara has different understandings of that machloket, but that understanding was suggested by a Professor Louis Ginsberg of the Jewish Theological Seminary. I just want to give him credit. He was affiliated with the conservative movement, but he was no slouch in terms of rabbinic literature. Yeah.
When you cook before Shabbat on Thursday or Wednesday,
right.
you say L'chvod Shabbat.
Some people do that. Some people do that. They say Lefot Shabbat on whatever they do, even if they're cooking it before Friday, and then you put it in the refrigerator or freezer, whatever. Beseda, all I'm saying is that there is a source, and that there could be. But the core mitzvah of Kvot Shabbat is that which we do on Friday in preparation of Shabbat, as opposed to Oneg Shabbat is that which we do on Shabbat for its enjoyment. And it is upgraded meals. First of all, most people ate 2 meals a day during the week, and on Shabbat there was Sudah Shlishit. No, because that was unusual, that they didn't eat 3 meals a day. So on Shabbat they would have another meal, Sudah Shlishit. And the content, the menu of what they're going to be eating was also upgraded and so on, in terms of better wine, better meat, and other delicacies and so on. And to this end, the author of the Yom Zeh Mechubad says, Echol mashmanim shtei mamtakim. We're going to eat, delicacies, fat foods, and sweet drinks. Ki el yiten lekol bo dvekim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave all this to us, to those who are connected to Him. We are blessed by having all this, and we have beged lilbosh, clothing to wear. Which means, you wear clothing on the weekday too, except that we're wearing special clothing for Shabbat. Lechem chukim. Lechem chukim, there's a phrase in the Mishlei that talks about lechem chuki. Lechem chuki means, it's a phrase that means basic bread. It means basic staple for bread. So one thing is, we have clothing to wear. We have our basics. Lechem chukim, we have our basic food. Thank God, God gives us everything. But not only He gives us the basics, He gives us basar b'dagim b'chol matamim, gives us extras. So we thank God for basics, and we thank God for the luxury items, the extras in life. This theme of a dual thanks for routine, for basics, as opposed to extra, stands behind or governs the fact that there are 2 different countings in the Sfirat HaOmer, the counting of the days and the counting of the weeks, because there were 2 different korbanot. The korban ha'omer, omer is simply a measure, like a kilo or a pound, whatever. It's a measure of grain. The grain was barley, and barley was always defined as animal feed, ma'achal behema. As we know from the korban of the Isha Sotah, it was barley and it was animal feed. Now, who eats animal feed? You'd rather have wheat, and wheat that's ground and baked nicely and so on, right? But if you don't have wheat, you will eat animal feed. That's the basics. That will keep you going. And what's the quantity of animal feed minimum that will keep you going? It's an omer's worth. Or if I translate it today, it's 1,200 calories worth of food. That's all. So if you're eating more than 1,200 calories, like most of us do, that's why we're on the treadmill, and that's why we're doing calisthenics, and that's why we're on diets, and so on. But if you just reflect back to the days of the Shoah, those who survived the first, the counting and the selection, right? The selection on the in Birkenau, which was 80% didn't survive, but the 20% that did survive, so they were given about 450 calories worth of food per day, which means it was obviously malnutritious, and most of them died from malnutrition at the end of the day. Those who were workers in the extreme conditions and so on. What was the Omer? Where did that come from? It came from the mun. We're going to get to the mun in a second. The mun was the bare minimum to keep a person alive for a day. And everybody got exactly that amount. And if somebody wanted to cheat and he came back home and measured it measured an omer. Kadosh Baruch Hu didn't let it, it was a no cheating scheme. So everybody got the same omer's worth of mun. And here, the Korban HaOmer on the second day of Pesach, on the 16th of Nisan, was to teach us that getting out of slavery was the basic need of Am Yisrael. That was the basic thing, to get out. But that's not what it was all about. It was to bring us to Chag HaShavuot and receive the Torah. And on Chag HaShavuot, we offered a different Korban. It was the 2 breads, the Shtei Lechem. And the Shtei Lechem was from wheat and had to be baked into chametz. Because if you have a choice between a nice warm lachmaniyah from Angel's Bakery, straight out of the oven, or a piece of hand shmura matzah, how many people are going to go for the shmura matzah? I know there's some people who, they got a thing for the... Most people who eat the shmura matzah on Seder night are doing it for the mitzvah. That's it. They would not ordinarily have chosen to eat shmura matzah as their bread. So that's what they do. But the shtei lechem on Chag HaShavuot had to dafka be chometz. It's the Torah says chametz te'afena. It had to be good, delicious bread from wheat, as opposed to the barley of the Korban HaOmer. And the reason is, and this is startling, because practically every Korban Mincha, which is the grain offering in Beit HaMikdash, not all, but practically all, were actually kosher lePesach the whole year. It was ugot matzot, belot b'shemen. They were matzahs. And was it uga matzah? Means round. Uga doesn't mean cake or cookie. The word uga that we use today for cake is because the cakes are baked round, right? There's a song that the kids all sing, uga, 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 right? It means a circle. Uga means a circle. So ugot matzot means round matzot. That's why till this very day, there's some people that feel they have to have round matzot and not square matzot. Beseda, but the Torah doesn't say that the matzah has to be round. The Torah says that the Korban Mincha, they were ugot matzot. But there were a handful of Korbanot Mincha that it was grain from wheat and had to also be a little bit chametz. That was the Korban Todah, the Thanksgiving offerings. But the most important exception was the two breads on Chag HaShavuot. And the understanding is that on Chag HaShavuot, we're now thanking God for beyond the basics, but for the extras. And the extras were the giving of the Torah. It would not have been enough to just have the Yetziat Mitzrayim. Yetziat Mitzrayim without the Kabbalat Torah would not have worked. So you have the idea of Basa Beged Lilbosh, Lechem Chukim, yes, basics, thank God. But we also have extras, Basar V'dagim, V'chol Matamim, meat, fish, and and there's some people that feel that if you don't have fish at the meal, and meat, you're not Yaitza, you're not... So the poet is not writing here, he's not telling you there's a halacha, you have to have meat and fish. It's telling you that these are the delicacies. This is beyond just bread. And it's also interesting, the order, because most people today would have fish and then would eat meat afterwards. Without getting into the whole question of mixing meat and fish, which the Gemara talks about as a type of a dangerous situation. But you can have meat and then fish afterwards. There's no waiting time, really. It's just that we are careful not to mix meat and fish at the same eating. V'chol matamim and all the other delicacies. So this third stanza basically focuses on the mitzvot of kavod and oneg. And I'll ask you a question. The Rambam talked about kavod Shabbat as cleaning the house and setting the table and bathing and setting nice clothing. Where does lighting candles Friday night come in? Is it kavod Shabbat or is it oneg Shabbat? Which category is it? It's one of the two. So you think it's oneg because you have to enjoy the candlelight. You have to somehow benefit from the candlelight Friday night when it's already Shabbat. Now, the only reason you can't light it then, because it's Shabbat. So it's as if we're lighting it Friday afternoon, but we really want it for Friday night. Except the Rambam talks about lighting Shabbos candles twice. Once when he talks about Kvod Shabbat, and once when he talks about Oneg Shabbat. Which means, and this led the Rav's uncle, Rav Yitzchak Zev, known as Rav Velvel Soloveitchik, to suggest that the Rambam obviously categorized Nerot Shabbat in both categories. It's Kvod Shabbat because it's part of our Friday preparation of Shabbat, and it's Oneg Shabbat because we have to enjoy the Shabbat Friday night through the candles. The candles are supposed to illuminate or even increase illumination. And I'll even tell you something interesting. When we got married, so we went to my parents or to my in-laws for a Shabbat. And the question was, does the young couple have to light candles if your mother or mother-in-law are lighting candles there? I mean, we all do it. But the question is, with a bracha, I mean, is it something that's obligatory and so on? And first the Rav thought that, maybe, you should light, let's say, in a different corner or in a different room even. But then at the end he backtracked and he said, no, you can light it in the same place. Why? Because additional light is also something. says every time you add another candle, you're adding the light of Shabbat. And obviously the light goes way beyond the physical light that's coming out of the flame. But there's some spirituality that's being invested into the house, and there's upgrade by more and more candles that are being lit. So you have Kavod Shabbat and Oneg Shabbat. I'm going to give you a case where you can just have the Oneg Shabbat perhaps without the Kavod Shabbat. You can't light candles at 10 in the morning, Friday. You can't do, even if you have a very long candle, or you have, gallons of oil that will keep keep burning throughout the night of Shabbat. You can't light candles at 10 in the morning or 11 in the morning. What's the earliest time that you can light Shabbos candles? Plaga Mincha, which is approximately an hour and a quarter before sundown. Right? An hour and a quarter relative time. Right now in the winter, the hour and a quarter wouldn't be 75 minutes, it would be maybe about an hour, maybe 62 minutes, 63 minutes before. There's in the calendars, it tells you when Plaga Mincha is. This becomes relevant in the summer when we have the early minyanim. So then the 75 minutes becomes expanded even to 80 minutes or whatever. So it's almost an hour and a half before sundown that you can light Shabbos candles. That means that Plaga Mincha, this zone, on some level already means it's the beginning of the next day. Even though if a child's born after Plaga Mincha, if a baby born before sundown, and it's after Plaga Mincha, a baby boy, the Brit is going to be on Friday, not on Shabbat. Even if a person made Shabbos. A person lit candles by Plaga Mincha on Friday in the summer, and the man went to shul, or maybe the lady went to shul too, and they're all davening, and so on, and all of a sudden they hear that they had a grandson, was born before sundown. So when is the Brit? The Brit is on Friday, because the date didn't change, just because you were allowed to light Shabbos candles from Plaga Mincha. Except that on some level, we consider it as if it's Yom HaShabbat. The most tangible is davening. When we daven early Friday night, and we come home before sundown, we've already davened Ma'ariv for Shabbat. We said L'chunu Ranana, we said L'chadoidi, we said everything. So it is Shabbat, you can't do Malacha, but the date didn't change yet. So that's interesting. But here you have a scenario where in northern parts of Europe, the situation was such that sundown was just ridiculously late, like 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night, and people couldn't do that, couldn't make Shabbos that late. It was difficult. So there was an allowance to light Shabbos candles even before Plaga Mincha without a bracha. Get this, without a bracha. And then by sundown, just to cover the eyes and make the bracha. And then they're lit. Now what do Ashkenaziot do anyway? We light, we cover our eyes, make the bracha, and then they're lit. So what's the difference if the candles are lit for 30 seconds before the bracha or 3.5 hours before the bracha? I'm not telling you to do this. I'm telling you that there was such a psak halacha in the Middle Ages for some communities that had trouble with the time zone for Shabbat. And then so you can have the Oneg Shabbat, even though maybe some facet of the Kavod Shabbat wasn't there. And now we get into the fourth stanza. Lo techsar kol bo v'achalta v'savata uverachta et Hashem Elokecha asher ahavta ki v'erachacha mikol ha'amim. This day, you were blessed from all the nations. Now this is straight out of, this has nothing to do with Shabbat. This has to do with benching, Birkat HaMazon. It's from Parshat Ekev, right? Parshat Ekev tells us v'achalta v'savata uverachta. Doesn't say a word there that it's about Shabbat. So why does the poet throw it in here? What's so special about Birkat HaMazon on Shabbat? Don't tell me we sing it around the table, and during the week we gobble it up. No. What? Okay, so there's an add-on just to mention Ritzei, Beseda, but that's just a special halacha, Baruch Hashem Yom Yom. If it's Rosh Chodesh, you mention Yalav Yavov, Rosh Chodesh. But that's not a benching thing. That's a Baruch Hashem Yom Yom thing. The benching, the Birkat HaMazon, is the same. So why does the Paitan throw in Birkat HaMazon? So you have to go back to Parshat Ekev and see the context, right? Like the president of Harvard said at that time, right? It's all in the context. You have to see the context. What's the context? The context was Moshe Rabbeinu's apology to Am Yisrael that you were tortured for 40 years in the desert with their menu and diet of man. Tortured. I didn't make that up. That's what the Chumash says. Vaya'ancha vayarivecha. You were tortured and you were starved. Vaya'ancha vayarivecha. I know there are different commentators who try to explain what that is, but I'm telling you what the Chizkuni, one of the Parshanim, says very openly. Yeah, it was a starving experience. Apparently, Chizkuni never heard of the Medrash that said that everything you wanted the man to taste like, it tasted like. So, you want steak and chips with a lot of ketchup on it, it tasted like steak and chips and a lot of ketchup. There's only one difference. It didn't look like steak and chips. And after a certain amount of time, it was, as my children and grandchildren taught me, this great Hebrew word, ichs. It didn't taste good. It didn't taste good. And you see in the Chumash, they're complaining, in Parshat Ba'alotcha, they're complaining bitterly to Moshe Rabbeinu about the man. Die, enough. We want something else on the menu. So came the slav, that's why the slav was introduced to the foul bird and so on. But it was not a good experience. They never had a sensation of being satisfied. They never got up from the meal of man. Ah, what a delicious meal. Ah. Never. They got up and they were still hungry. Vaya'ancha vayarivecha. So they didn't die. They had enough calories to get away. And Moshe Rabbeinu apologizes. Vaya'ancha vayarivecha vayachilcha et haman asher lo yadata v'lo yadun avotecha. And you ate food that your forefathers never saw. Why? Leman hodiacha, to teach you a lesson. Ki lo ala lechem levado yichyeh ha'adam, ki al kol motza fi Hashem yichyeh ha'adam. Man does not live on bread alone, but lives by the pi Hashem, what a Kadosh Baruch Hu gives us. Ki lo ala lechem levado yichyeh ha'adam. Levado. You need bread, but not bread alone. Ki al kol motza fi Hashem. What comes out of God's mouth, that's what's going to keep you alive. And that was the lesson. But Moshe Rabbeinu says, I got great news for you. You're all, not me, but you're going into Eretz Yisrael. And there it's going to be different. It's going to be a land, lo techsar kol bo. It is missing nothing. It has all the necessary resources for wonderful life. For wonderful life. It has Eretz chita u'sa'ora, gefen, te'ena, v'rimon, Eretz, zeit shemen, udvash, the 7 species of the fruits of Eretz Yisrael. Ve'achalta, v'savata, whoa, new word. They never heard of this word before, v'savata. My grandfather was born in a shtetl in Galicia, and his younger brother, who was an great uncle of mine, asked him once. The word savea, the savata, in Yiddish is zat. Zat. That's how the Rebbe in the Cheder, the Malamed in the Cheder, translated, you will eat, vels essen, and you'll be zat. You'll be vesavata. And my great uncle asked my grandfather, Vus mentas, what does that mean? He was never savea. They didn't have food. There were 16 children around the table. And there was not enough food. My grandfather told me if one of the kids didn't want to eat, it wasn't like today, SS, eat. No, it was a yashikoyach. They got a big yashikoyach. You don't want to eat? Fine. Now there's a little bit more, another morsel of food for the next one. That was the situation in Poland at the time, the turn of the 20th century. So what is visavata? What does that mean? Bnei Israel in the Midbar could have asked the same question. What are you talking about? Visavata. Never heard of the word, never heard of the concept, never spelt it. You're going to be full and satisfied, satiated. But don't forget, doesn't say bless God for the food. Doesn't say that. It says bless HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the land. What does al haaretz mean? Concerning. Just like Vaitzav Hashem Elokim al ha'adam in the story of Gan Eden. Vaitzav Hashem Elokim al ha'adam. The Rav translated it, and the Kadosh Baruch Hu commanded man concerning, al adam, concerning. So v'achalte v'savata u'verachta et Hashem Elokecha al haaretz, concerning the land. You're going to bless the Kadosh Baruch Hu. He gave us the land. So every time you say Birkat HaMazon in Teaneck, in Los Angeles, in Melbourne, in London, you're thanking HaKadosh Baruch Hu for giving us the land, Eretz Yisrael. That's what we're saying, Birkat HaMazon. And the land, this message, all emanated from man. What was the message that man taught us? That the seventh day is special. On 6 days the man will fall, and on the seventh day it won't fall. You'll have 2 measures, 2 portions on Friday, Lechem Mishnah. So Am Yisrael tastes on their taste buds Shabbat through the whole idea of man. And the whole idea of Birkat HaMazon is given against the background of man that fell in the desert 40 years, and now you're going to have the 7 species, and there's Birkat HaMazon. You're going to remember the idea of Shabbat by remembering the land. And the land, you're not going to work on Shabbat. So there's a connection of the land and Shabbat. And there's going to be a type of Shabbat that's going to multiply this message, and it's called Shemitah, 7th year, V'shavta ha'aretz Shabbat Lashem. And Rashi says, Kimo Shabbat Bereshit, just like it's another version of a Shabbat. It's a magnified version of Shabbat. And all this has to do with Shabbat. And hence the poet throws it all in here. Lo techsar kol bo, Eretz Yisrael is missing nothing. Ve'achalta v'savata, ve'rachta et Hashem Elokecha asher ahavta. Ki ve'rachecha mikol ha'amim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is giving you the great blessing beyond anything of any other nation. So you have Birkat HaAretz as part of Birkat HaShabbat right here. And then he takes us back to the creation story. Began with the creation story of Sheshit Yamim Taseh Melachtecha V'yom Hashvi'i Shabbat L'Elokecha. Ki kol asar Sheshit Yamim. He ends the poem on the theme of Shabbat, of creation as well. Hashamayim Misaprim Kvodo. That's a pasuk from Tehillim. We know it on Shabbat. We say Lam Nasech V'Dvar David Hashamayim Misaprim Kvod El U'Maseh Yadav Magid Harakia. And so the sky speaks of the glory. There's a pasuk in Tehillim Pereket. Ki er'eh shamecha ma'aseh etzba'otecha yareach v'kochavim asher konanta. Just gaze at the heavenly bodies. Just gaze up there. Ma enosh ki tizkerenu ven adam ki tefkedenu. What is man? You shrivel up into nothing. You become what the Rav once called a piece of cosmic dust. You're just nothing. Apparently, you look at the whole constellations, the whole celestial vision and picture and so on. Hashamayim misaprim kavod el speaks of the glory. There's a concept in philosophy called the cosmological argument, the proving that God exists from the movements of the celestial bodies. V'gam ha'aretz mal'ach hasdo, the land, the earth, is also full of Kadosh Baruch Hu's grace. Re'u ki chol eile asta yado. Take a look. Who made all this? This is taken out of the chapter of Yeshayahu, end of the book, 66, Samach Vav, that we read for the Haftarah of Shabbat Rosh Chodesh, whenever there is a Shabbat Rosh Chodesh. Ko amar Hashem, Hashamayim kis'i, ve'ha'aretz hadom raglai, eze bayet asher tivnu li, ve'eze makom menuchati, ki chol eile asta yado. This phrase is lifted right out of Yeshayahu Samach Vav in reference to Shamayim Ha'aretz. So the author rephrases it. He takes the pasuk from Tehillim, but he's rephrasing Yeshayahu of Shamayim and Ha'aretz. Re'u, take a look. Who made all this? We understand. Ki hu hatzur pa'alo tamim. Now that's out of Ha'azino. We mentioned last week from Devarim Lamed Bet. Hatzur tamim pa'alo. He's the rock that pa'alo tamim. All of his actions are complete. El emunah ve'ein avel tzadik v'yasharhu. We use this pasuk in the service of tziduk hadin, just to accept, let's just say, tragic and very, very, very bad moments in life, tragic moments in life, painful moments in life. We say atzur tamim palo ki chol derachav mishpat el emunah ve'ein avel tzadik v'yasharhu. Why in the world would the Paitan, after such an exhilarating poem about Shabbat, he ends with Kihu Hatzur Pa'alot Tamim. Now you can just say he lifted it, he took the first part of the pasuk, which is very nice. It's about HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He's the one that makes everything complete, and everything I said is all God. Hatzur Tamim Pa'alot. But you can't miss the fact that that pasuk initiates a pasuk of Tziduk Adin. El emunah ve'ein avel tzadik v'yashar hu. If not for the fact that the author in the 12th century is writing against the background of very difficult days that Am Yisrael went through in the 12th century. In Europe, for sure. In North Africa, for sure. And even in Yemen. Whether it was the sword of the church, whether it was the sword of the Muslims, whether it was in Eretz Yisrael, the Tzalbanim, the Crusaders here, it was a very, very, very bad time for Am Yisrael. And I think somebody who kept Shabbos in the 12th century, it was heroic. Because here's a man who went from being a goy to being Jewish, where it was not popular to do. If the church heard about it in Europe, it was a death sentence, by the way. And the traffic was going the other way, from being Jewish to being Christian, from being Jewish to being Muslim. That's where most of the traffic was going, not the other way, becoming Jewish. It was not popular at all to be Jewish, and certainly idiotic to wanting to become Jewish. You know, the first thing the Rambam says if a ger comes forward and wants to convert is you have to give him a crash course in Jewish history and show him why it's not worth his while. It's not worth his while. It's just that we're a suffering people. And after a crash course in Jewish history, if he says, Afal Pichein, nevertheless, I know, I studied, and I want to be part of this, then we move on with the process of accepting him as a convert. The idea of, in the 12th century, somebody wanting to be Jewish, he has to explain, or at least make a statement, of the while still worthwhile observing Shabbat. And he says, you know, I don't even have an answer. He comes back to Tziduk Adin. Hatzur tamim pa'alo, kichol derachav mishpat, el emunah ve'ein avel, tzadik v'yashar hu. I have deep faith that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has his calculations of how he's running the world. And we're going to carry on with the spirit of Shabbat. Because Yom Zeh Mechubad Mikol Yamim, Kivo Shabbat, Tzur Olamim. He began with Tzur and ends with the Tzur. The same image of HaKadosh Baruch Hu at the beginning and the end. Okay, next week, I'm just going to make casual mention of the Om Nitzorah because I have it on the page. It'll just take a few minutes to make some comments on this. This is the piyut that we say, the Ashkenazim say, on Shabbat of Chag HaSukkot, when there's no Hashanas, going Lulav and Esrog during the saying of Hashanah, and it's the Hoshana of Shabbat. And then we will do the song of Ya'ech Sof, that many of us have begun singing, a Hasidic song, and it's now printed in some of the Zmironim, some of the benches, Ya'ech Sof. I'll try to play a musical version of it at the beginning, just to get a little bit of a tasting of it. How many of you sing Ya'ech Sof? We do once in a while. Not many. How many are familiar with the song Ya'ech Sof? Ya'ech Sof. Ya'ech Sof nam shavasai ya 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 yamat meden tachedet mesu. Okay, good. I'm going to teach a song next week and a difficult piyut, because it says nothing about the physical enjoyment of Shabbat. What we've been seeing so far in the Zmirot, they all harp on the basar v'dagim v'chol matamim, and now you're going to hear something from Rabbi Aharon from Karlin of the 19th century, authors this most moving spiritual ode to Shabbat. And that's the Ya'ech Sof. We'll do it next week. That's Shem. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's really something.
Yeah.
But, I always thought Lo Texar meant you will not let.
No. It's come from the Chumash. It means that Eretz Yisrael won't miss anything. Yeah.
My grandmother was in Europe for 13 years with 3 children, and she raised barley, which I found out was for beer. That's how she
Beer.
supported
Okay.
herself.
Okay.
She came to America
smart
to be
lady.
Shomer Shabbos.
Smart lady.
They moved up to upstate New York and opened up a grocery store.
Okay.
13 years.
There you
3
go.